Hi, I'm Maya. I'm 30 years old, and today I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar real estate investment firm. But if you had looked at my life exactly 8 years ago, you would have seen a tragedy that absolutely shattered my world. At 22, my own parents violently evicted me from the only true home I ever had, throwing me out into the freezing dead of winter with nothing but 2 suitcases, all so they could hand my house over to my entitled golden child sister. But don't worry, this isn't a sad story. It ends with a secret foreclosure auction, a massive Thanksgiving dinner ambush, and me publicly serving my entire family with a 30-day eviction notice from the very estate they stole from me. Before I tell you exactly how I bought my family's bankrupt estate in cash and completely ruined their fake country club reputation, I have a quick question. Where in the world are you watching this video from, and what time is it? Drop it in the comments below, because I have a feeling you're going to be staying up way too late to finish this insane story. To really understand how I ended up serving my parents' eviction papers over a Thanksgiving turkey, we have to go back to when I was 22 years old. Back then, I was light years away from being a CEO. I was a broke college student studying business, pulling exhausting double shifts as a waitress at a local diner just to keep my head above water. In my family, I was always the undeniable black sheep. My parents, Robert and Susan, were completely obsessed with their image. They measured a person's worth entirely by the brand of car they drove, the zip code they lived in, and the country club memberships they held. My older sister, Chloe, was the undisputed golden child. She was the perfect, compliant daughter who never worked a hard day in her life, perfectly mirroring my parents' superficial values. While I was scrubbing tables and pulling all-nighters to pass my exams, Chloe was getting regular allowances to fund her shopping habits. The only person in my family who ever truly saw me, who actually believed in my relentless work ethic, was my grandfather. He was a tough, hardworking man who built his life from the ground up, and we shared a bond that my parents never understood. When he passed away, it absolutely broke my heart. But a few weeks after his funeral, the lawyer called with news that shocked our entire family. My grandfather had bypassed my parents entirely and left his modest, beautifully maintained, fully paid-off starter home directly to me. For a 22-year-old waitress drowning in student loans, this wasn't just a house. It was a miraculous lifeline. It was a foundation for my future, a profound gift of love and belief from the only person who mattered. But the moment the deed was transferred into my name, the toxic machinery of my family immediately sprang into action. You see, right around the time I inherited the house, my sister Chloe had just gotten engaged to her equally pretentious fiancé. They were planning an extravagant wedding they couldn't afford, and suddenly they needed a place to live. One Sunday evening, my parents summoned me to their pristine, overly decorated living room. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't even offer me a glass of water. My father, Robert, just coldly handed me a stack of transfer documents and a pen. He demanded, without a single ounce of hesitation or shame, that I immediately sign the deed of my grandfather's house over to Chloe. Susan chimed in, using her sickly, sweet, manipulative voice, claiming that Chloe needs a proper home to start a family, and that I was too young and irresponsible to manage a property anyway. They genuinely believed I existed solely to be a stepping stone for Chloe's perfect life. I refused. For the first time in my life, I looked them dead in the eye and said absolutely not. I told them the house was a gift to me, that Grandpa wanted me to have it, and that I would never hand it over to fund Chloe's unearned lifestyle. The explosion that followed was terrifying. My parents didn't just get angry, they decided to utterly destroy me. Because I wouldn't comply, Robert and Susan hired a ruthless, high-priced attorney and dug up an old, highly disputed power of attorney document my grandfather had signed years ago when he was briefly medicated. It was a sneaky, disgusting legal loophole, but with their wealth and connections, they managed to tie the deed up in a vicious court battle I couldn't afford to fight. Weeks later, right in the middle of January, the unthinkable happened. I was officially forced out of my own home. I will never, ever forget the sheer cruelty of that day. It was freezing cold, snow was falling heavily, and I was standing on the curb crying, clutching two battered suitcases containing everything I owned. And as I stood there shivering in the cold, I watched Chloe and her fiancé happily directing movers to carry their expensive, brand-new furniture into my grandfather's house. My parents stood on the porch, sipping hot coffee, completely ignoring my existence. They threw me out into the winter snow and didn't even blink. I had nowhere to go, no money, and no family left. But as I walked away that day, I made a silent, unbreakable promise to myself. I was going to survive, I was going to get richer than all of them combined, and one day, I was going to take everything back. That first night after the eviction was a special kind of hell that I wouldn't wish on my absolute worst enemy. I dragged my two battered suitcases through the freezing slush of the Boston suburbs, the bitter wind cutting right through my thin winter coat, until I finally reached my used, beat-up Honda Civic parked a few blocks away. My hands were shaking so violently from the cold, the betrayal, and the sheer shock of what had just transpired that it took me 3 tries just to get the key into the ignition. I turned the heater on full blast, locked all the doors, curled up in the cramped back seat under every piece of clothing I owned, and sobbed until I literally couldn't breathe. Have you ever experienced a betrayal so deep, so viscerally cruel from the people who were supposed to unconditionally love and protect you, that it literally physically hurts your chest and makes you question your entire reality? Let me know in the comments how you survived your absolute lowest moment, because sitting in that freezing car as the snow piled up on the windshield, I honestly didn't know if I was going to make it to the morning. For the next 12 agonizing months, that cramped, freezing Honda Civic became my entire world, my sanctuary, and my prison. I became an absolute master at the exhausting art of invisible survival. Every single morning at 5:00 a.m., before the sun even thought about coming up, I would scrape the thick ice off my windshield with numb fingers and drive to a dirt cheap, 24-hour gym just to take a hot shower, brush my teeth, and try to feel human again. I would carefully apply my makeup in the steamy locker room mirror, put on a bright, fake smile, and go work grueling double shifts at the local diner, pouring endless cups of coffee and serving pancakes to people who had absolutely no idea I was going to sleep in a dark parking lot that night. The sheer physical exhaustion was bone-crushing, my feet ached constantly, and my hands were always blistered. But that physical toll was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological warfare my parents were maliciously waging behind my back. You see, in the wealthy, image-obsessed country club circles my parents so desperately clung to, having a homeless daughter is the ultimate social suicide. It destroys the perfect facade they had spent decades building. So, rather than admit the horrifying, shameful truth that they had forcefully evicted their own child into the winter snow, just to hand her inheritance over to their entitled golden child, Robert and Susan completely fabricated a brand new, highly convenient reality. I found out through a sympathetic old high school friend that my parents were actively telling everyone at their exclusive country club that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown, that I had angrily rejected their loving, generous support, and that I had simply run away to find myself and cruelly cut them off. They played the tragic, heartbroken parents flawlessly, shedding crocodile tears and soaking up the endless sympathy of their wealthy friends, while I was literally rationing cheap peanut butter sandwiches in the back of a freezing Honda, trying to figure out how to afford gas for the week. Can you even fathom the terrifying level of narcissistic delusion it takes to steal your own child's home, throw them out onto the street, and then completely convince yourself that you are the victim of the story? Have any of you ever dealt with a narcissist who was so skilled at spinning lies that they actually made everyone believe you were the crazy one? Share your experiences below, because I know how incredibly isolating and maddening that gaslighting can be. Hearing those malicious lies spread by my own mother and father could have broken me permanently. It could have pushed me over the edge into complete despair, but instead, it did something entirely different. It flipped a massive, irreversible switch deep inside my brain. The crippling sadness and the desperate yearning for their love completely evaporated, and in its place, a cold, hyper-focused, terrifying rage took over. I realized with absolute clarity that crying in my car wasn't going to get my grandfather's house back. I realized that waiting around for an apology from people who fundamentally lacked a soul was a pathetic waste of my time. I decided right then and there, staring at the frost on my windows, that I was going to channel every single ounce of my anger, every freezing night, every hunger pang, and every tear into raw, unstoppable, ruthless ambition. I took the meager, wrinkled dollar bills I earned from my diner tips and bought heavily highlighted, second-hand real estate textbooks from a local thrift store. Every single night, after working 14 agonizing hours on my feet, I would park my car under a bright, flickering street lamp behind a desolate strip mall and study for my real estate license, until my eyes literally could not stay open. I meticulously memorized complex zoning laws, intricate contract structures, and advanced financial formulas by the dim yellow glow of that street lamp, turning my makeshift, freezing bedroom into a high-stakes classroom of vengeance. And you know what? The grueling sacrifice actually worked. I passed my state licensing exam on the very first try with flying colors. But as anyone in the business will tell you, getting a license is just a piece of paper. Making actual, life-changing money in real estate with absolutely zero capital, zero connections, and a Honda Civic as your corporate office is a completely different, almost impossible mountain to climb. I knew I couldn't just walk into a luxury downtown brokerage in my cheap clothes and ask for a desk, so I decided to start at the absolute bottom of the barrel. I started hunting for distressed, abandoned, nightmare properties. The ugly, crumbling, neglected houses that no sane investor wanted to touch. I would spend my precious days off driving through rundown neighborhoods, writing down the addresses of overgrown, boarded-up houses with collapsing roofs, and painstakingly tracking down the desperate, motivated owners through public records. I taught myself the difficult, grueling art of wholesaling, convincing these highly motivated sellers to sign purchase contracts with me, and then frantically hustling to flip those exact contracts to wealthy cash buyers for a small, quick finder's fee. My very first successful deal netted me exactly $3,000. To my parents, $3,000 was a casual weekend shopping trip for Chloe at the boutique mall. But to me, it was the most beautiful, glorious money I had ever seen in my entire life. It was the exact amount I needed to finally put down a security deposit on a tiny, roach-infested, drafty studio apartment and sleep in a real, warm bed for the first time in a year. I want to pause and ask you guys, what was the very first paycheck, the first big break, or the first major milestone that made you feel like you were finally going to make it out of your struggle and change your life? Drop your proudest hustle moments and success stories in the comments, because celebrating those small, hard-fought wins is exactly how you build an unbreakable empire. Once I finally had a secure roof over my head and didn't have to worry about freezing to death, I became absolutely relentless. I didn't take a single day off, a single vacation, or a single weekend to relax for the next 3 years. I aggressively reinvested every single penny I made right back into the business, living off ramen noodles and sheer willpower. I quickly transitioned from wholesaling other people's problems to actually buying and flipping the distressed properties myself, doing the grueling, back-breaking demolition work with my own bare hands just to save money on expensive contractors. I would be knocking down moldy drywall and ripping up rotten floorboards at 2:00 a.m., covered head to toe in toxic dust and sweat, fueled purely by the vivid, burning, unforgettable image of my parents casually sipping hot coffee on the porch the day they threw me out. My relentless work ethic, my absolute refusal to take no for an answer, and my obsessive, almost terrifying attention to detail quickly started catching the eye of major, heavy-hitting players in the city. Wealthy investors, the kind of people with vastly more money than time, realized that if they blindly backed my projects, I would practically guarantee them a massive, risk-free return. I slowly, carefully, and strategically built an ironclad network of loyal investors, skilled contractors, and powerful mentors who deeply respected me for my grit and business acumen, completely unaware of the tragic, traumatic backstory that was driving my every move. I wasn't just flipping small suburban houses anymore. I was acquiring massive multi-family apartment buildings, lucrative commercial spaces, and huge, empty development plots. I formed a complex corporate LLC, purposefully hiding my identity behind layers of legal protection and ironclad non-disclosure agreements, completely separating the wealthy, powerful, untouchable CEO I was becoming from the broken, crying 22-year-old girl my family had thrown away like trash. As the zeros in my bank account multiplied exponentially, my real estate empire grew in complete and total secrecy. I purposely stayed off all personal social media, avoiding the flashy, desperate, look-at-me lifestyle my sister Chloe was so deeply addicted to. I was a total ghost to my family, a ghost they comfortably assumed had faded away into poverty, addiction, and failure just like they planned. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy maxing out high-interest credit cards to pretend they were still old money rich, the daughter they maliciously discarded was quietly buying up half the city, sharpening her claws, and meticulously preparing for the exact moment their fragile, pathetic house of cards would inevitably collapse. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on notifications right now. 8 years is a massive, transformative amount of time when you are building a real estate empire from the absolute ground up. But looking back now from the luxurious view of my corner office, it feels like it all passed in the blink of an eye. Fast forward to the present day, and the terrified, heartbroken 22-year-old girl who once sobbed uncontrollably in the freezing backseat of a beat-up Honda Civic is officially dead and gone. In her place stands a 30-year-old CEO who commands one of the most aggressive, highly successful, and rapidly expanding real estate investment firms in the entire state. Let me ask you guys a deep question before we go any further. Have you ever looked back at a deeply traumatic period in your own life and realized that you have reinvented yourself so completely, so powerfully, that the broken person who went through that pain feels like a total stranger to you now? Drop a comment below and tell me about the moment you finally realized you had outgrown your trauma, because that realization was the exact foundation of my entire empire. By the time I turned 30, my firm wasn't just flipping rundown suburban houses anymore. We were actively acquiring massive commercial plazas, orchestrating multi-million-dollar luxury high-rise developments, and fundamentally reshaping the very skyline of the city that had once tried to freeze me out in the dead of winter. But if you tried to look up my name on public property records, search for my personal profile on social media, or dig into the local society pages, you wouldn't find a single, solitary trace of my existence. I had meticulously and deliberately built my entire corporate empire under a complex, impenetrable web of anonymous LLCs, offshore holding companies, and blind corporate trusts, keeping my personal identity completely hidden behind a fortress of expensive lawyers and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. I wasn't just incredibly wealthy now. I was completely insulated, thriving in total anonymity, and surrounded by a fiercely loyal, beautiful chosen family of friends, mentors, elite contractors, and investors who deeply respected the blood, sweat, and tears I had poured into my business. My Thanksgiving dinners weren't filled with toxic judgment, passive-aggressive insults, or terrifying ultimatums anymore. They were filled with genuine, warm laughter, massive, joyous feasts, and the incredible company of people who actually loved me for exactly who I was, not for what financial assets they could extract from me. I had built my own paradise. But while I was quietly buying up commercial real estate, renovating luxury apartment complexes, and living a life of absolute, profound peace, my biological family was living out a completely different, infinitely more pathetic reality just a few towns over. Robert, Susan, and my golden child sister Chloe were absolutely suffocating under the crushing, unavoidable weight of their own superficial expectations and toxic arrogance. You see, maintaining a pristine, ultra-wealthy, old-money image in a judgmental high society country club is astronomically expensive, especially when absolutely nobody in the family actually works a real, demanding job. For years, my parents and Chloe had been living vastly, dangerously beyond their means, trapped in a vicious, never-ending cycle of trying to impress snobby people who didn't even genuinely like them in the first place. I want to pause right here and ask you guys a very serious question. Have you ever looked at someone's flawlessly curated, seemingly perfect Instagram feed? The designer bags, the luxury cars, the endless European vacations, and just known, deep down in your gut, that they were secretly drowning in massive, unmanageable credit card debt just to keep up appearances. Drop a comment below if you know exactly the type of fake flexers I'm talking about, because my family was the absolute textbook, undeniable definition of this pathetic financial delusion. Through mutual acquaintances in the city, I occasionally heard exhausted, mocking whispers about their lavish lifestyle. Chloe was driving a brand new, top-of-the-line luxury SUV that was leased every single year. Robert was constantly bragging about his terrible stock investments at the country club bar. And Susan was purchasing endless streams of designer clothes and expensive jewelry just to wear to local charity galas where she could pretend she was a philanthropist. What absolutely nobody at their prestigious country club knew was the dark, horrifying secret of exactly how they were funding this ridiculous, fake-rich charade. To maintain their illusion of wealth, Robert and Susan had secretly taken out multiple, massive, high-interest mortgages on the only truly valuable asset they had left to their name: my late grandfather's beloved house. Yes, the exact same modest, beautifully maintained, fully paid-off starter home that they had violently and maliciously evicted me from 8 years ago in the dead of winter. They treated my grandfather's hard-earned legacy like a personal, bottomless ATM machine, recklessly and arrogantly pulling out equity year after year to pay off their maxed-out platinum credit cards, fund their ridiculous, exorbitant country club membership fees, and cater to Chloe's wildly entitled demands for a lavish lifestyle she never earned. They genuinely believed that the money would just magically keep flowing forever, completely blinded by their own narcissism and financial illiteracy. But the bill always comes due eventually, and the cold, hard mathematics of compound interest never, ever lies. By the time I celebrated my 30th birthday in my luxury downtown penthouse, the financial well at the estate had completely and utterly run dry. The chickens had finally come home to roost in the most devastating way possible. My parents and my golden child sister were secretly over $800,000 in severe, crippling debt, completely underwater on their multiple, predatory mortgages, and the bank had officially run out of patience. The bank was now aggressively threatening immediate, irreversible foreclosure on the estate. The final, bright red warning notices were arriving in the Daily Mail. The frantic, threatening calls from aggressive debt collectors were ringing off the hook at all hours of the day. And the sheer, undeniable panic inside that stolen house must have been absolutely deafening. They were completely terrified, cornered like desperate rats on a sinking ship, frantically trying to figure out how to hide their impending, catastrophic bankruptcy and inevitable social ruin from their highly judgmental high society friends. Chloe's equally pretentious, gold-digging fiancé was already starting to ask very uncomfortable questions about where the family money was going, and Robert and Susan were rapidly running out of lies to tell to cover their tracks. They were on the absolute brink of losing everything they had ever cared about: their home, their status, and their precious reputation. And they had absolutely nobody to blame but their own toxic, uncontrollable greed. But just as they were preparing to face the humiliating reality of living on the street, the universe, in all of its glorious, unpredictable, poetic justice, delivered the most devastating leak of information in the history of the world. A leak that would set the stage for the most satisfying, explosive revenge you could possibly imagine. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and turn on all your notifications right now. Because in Part 4, a completely accidental discovery is going to reveal my massive wealth to my desperate family, leading them to commit the absolute ultimate act of audacity by showing up at my corporate headquarters after 8 years of dead silence. And you will not believe the beautiful, devastating trap I meticulously set for them in response. It is a universally acknowledged truth that the universe possesses a highly ironic, almost cinematic sense of timing when it comes to delivering long overdue karma. And the absolute unraveling of my parents' fake rich facade began on a remarkably ordinary Tuesday afternoon. My father, Robert, was sitting inside the lavish, mahogany-paneled lounge of his exclusive country club, nervously nursing a cheap scotch he could barely afford to put on his tab, desperately ignoring the relentless, vibrating phone calls from aggressive debt collectors in his pocket. He was completely cornered, sweating under his expensive golf shirt, knowing that the bank was just days away from officially foreclosing on the estate they had stolen from me, which would inevitably broadcast their catastrophic financial ruin to the entire high society world they worshipped. In a pathetic attempt to distract himself from his impending doom, he casually picked up a freshly printed copy of a prestigious local business magazine that someone had discarded on the leather sofa next to him. It was a highly anticipated special edition featuring the top 30 under 30 business leaders in the city. He lazily flipped through the thick, glossy pages, likely searching for wealthy local investors he could try to scam a personal loan from, when he suddenly froze, his blood running completely ice-cold in his veins. There, spanning a massive, beautifully photographed 2-page centerfold spread, was a professional, undeniable portrait of me. I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored designer suit, standing confidently with my arms crossed in front of a multi-million-dollar commercial high-rise development my firm had just acquired downtown. The bold, glittering headline highlighted my incredible, unprecedented rise from a struggling waitress living in her car to a ruthless real estate mogul, praising my anonymous corporate firm for generating record-breaking 8-figure revenues and fundamentally transforming the city's skyline. Can you even begin to imagine the sheer, heart-stopping shock, the visceral panic, and the undeniable humiliation crashing down on my father's aging face when he realized that the exact same daughter he had coldly thrown into the winter snow with nothing but 2 suitcases was now a wildly successful millionaire? Most normal, loving parents would feel a profound sense of shame, deep guilt, or maybe even a sliver of pride for what their child had miraculously accomplished against all impossible odds. But not Robert. Instead of feeling a single ounce of remorse for the horrifying abuse he had put me through, his toxic, parasitic instincts immediately kicked into high gear. He didn't look at that glossy magazine and see a daughter who had barely survived his cruelty. He looked at that magazine and saw a walking, breathing $800,000 get-out-of-jail-free card. He practically sprinted out of the country club, sped back to the heavily mortgaged estate, and slammed the magazine down on the kitchen table in front of my mother, Susan, and my entitled golden child sister, Chloe. Realizing that the child they threw away like garbage was now incredibly wealthy enough to easily pay off their massive, crippling debts with a single signature, they instantly hatched a sick, manipulative, and incredibly bold plan to drag me back into their twisted web. They genuinely, arrogantly believed that simply because we shared the same DNA, I was somehow morally obligated to save them from the exact financial ruin they had selfishly brought upon themselves. I have to ask you guys right now, and please be brutally honest in the comments. If you were in my shoes and found out your lifelong abusers were on the absolute brink of losing everything they had ever cared about, would you step in to help them out of the goodness of your heart, or would you pull up a front row chair and happily watch their empire crash and burn? Let me know your honest thoughts, because my reaction was about to set a trap they would never see coming. Just 3 days after that magazine hit the stands, I was sitting in my corner office on the top floor of my firm's downtown corporate headquarters. It was a beautiful, sprawling space with panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the very city skyline I had spent the last 8 years quietly conquering. I was in the middle of reviewing complex architectural blueprints when the intercom on my polished mahogany desk suddenly buzzed. It was my executive assistant, and her voice sounded incredibly tense, confused, and slightly panicked. She told me that there were 3 people standing in the pristine corporate lobby claiming to be my parents and my older sister, aggressively demanding to see me immediately and making a huge, entitled scene in front of my staff. Now, my assistant has worked fiercely and loyally by my side for 5 years, and in all that time, she had never once heard me mention having a living family. My blood instantly ran ice cold, my stomach completely dropped, and the expensive pen I was holding practically snapped in my white-knuckled grip. But that icy, terrified panic only lasted for a fraction of a second before my hardened, battle-tested CEO instincts completely took over. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed my tailored blazer, and calmly instructed her to send them back to my office. When the heavy, soundproof double doors of my office dramatically swung open, it took every single ounce of professional composure I possessed not to physically laugh out loud at the pathetic, transparent sight standing before me. After 8 long years of absolute, dead silence, there they stood: Robert, Susan, and Chloe. They were draped head to toe in flashy designer clothes, desperately trying to project an aura of immense wealth and old money superiority. But from behind the safety of my massive desk, I could immediately see the frantic, suffocated exhaustion hiding just beneath their heavily powdered faces and forced smiles. Susan didn't even wait for a formal greeting. She immediately launched into an absolutely sickening, Oscar-worthy performance. She rushed across the expansive room, fake crocodile tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, and tried to pull me into a suffocating hug, wailing dramatically about how much she had missed her precious baby girl, and how the family just hasn't been the same without me. Robert stood right behind her, puffing out his chest and offering a condescending, fake-proud smile, boldly claiming that he always knew I had it in me to be incredibly successful. Chloe just stood there awkwardly in the background, clutching a leased Prada bag like a life preserver, forcing a tight, incredibly bitter smile that looked like it was physically causing her severe pain. For the next 20 agonizing minutes, I sat completely silent behind my desk and just let them talk, listening in pure, morbid fascination as they completely and utterly attempted to rewrite history. They didn't offer a single genuine apology for maliciously evicting me. They didn't apologize for the freezing winter nights I spent sobbing and sleeping in the backseat of my car. Instead, Robert actually had the sickening, unbelievable nerve to look me dead in the eye and claim that kicking me out with nothing was actually a deliberate, loving act of tough love, perfectly designed to teach me independence and push me toward my true potential. Have you ever had a toxic family member try to completely rewrite a traumatic event to make themselves look like the hero of your story? Or worse, try to take credit for the success you built while surviving the trauma they caused you? Tell me about your absolute worst gaslighting experiences in the comments below, because listening to them try to take credit for my empire took every ounce of restraint I had. I didn't scream, I didn't throw my coffee cup at the wall, and I didn't call building security to have them forcefully dragged out of my lobby, even though every fiber of my being desperately wanted to. I just sat there, my face a completely unreadable, terrifying stone mask, waiting patiently for the inevitable pivot. I knew deep down they weren't there for a heartwarming family reunion. They were there for a desperate financial bailout. And sure enough, after thoroughly exhausting their fake tears and hollow compliments, Robert cleared his throat, shifted uncomfortably in his plush leather guest chair, and finally dropped the loving father act. He put on his most authoritative voice and casually mentioned that the family estate, my late grandfather's beloved house, the exact one they had stolen from me, was currently facing a tiny, temporary cash flow issue. He dramatically sighed, shifting the blame entirely onto the economy and everything under the sun except their own reckless spending. Then he leaned forward, looked at me with this sickeningly expectant, entitled gaze, and demanded that I immediately write them a check for $800,000 to save the family legacy from the bank. Susan chimed in, claiming it was my fundamental duty as a daughter to step up and protect the family's honor. The sheer, breathtaking irony of them using my grandfather's legacy to extort nearly $1 million from me when they had literally used a disgusting legal loophole to snatch that exact same legacy out of my hands was almost too perfect. The old Maya would have broken down crying, but the CEO sitting across from them only felt a cold hunger for public destruction. I didn't say yes, but I purposefully didn't say no. I put on a completely neutral expression and told them I would need a few days to consult with my financial advisors to move some corporate assets around. The wave of relief that washed over their faces was disgusting. Robert, fully believing his manipulation had worked, immediately went in for the kill. Assuming he had the check in the bag, he excitedly told me they were hosting a massive Thanksgiving dinner at the estate the following week, inviting over 60 elite friends, and insisted I attend as the guest of honor. I knew exactly what he was doing, setting up a high-stakes public spectacle to corner me in front of 60 wealthy people, publicly announce my gift, and use social pressure to force me into handing over the check. But what they fundamentally failed to realize as they happily walked out of my office, silently celebrating their unearned victory, was that I wasn't walking blindly into their trap. I was the apex predator, and they had just willingly handed me the keys to their own slaughterhouse. Because the second they left, I didn't call my financial advisor to free up cash. I called my legal team to pull the bank records for my grandfather's house, uncovering a massive secret that was going to turn their perfect Thanksgiving dinner into a catastrophic nightmare. Make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because in Part 5, we are going to crash the most arrogant Thanksgiving dinner in history. And you do not want to miss the glorious mic drop moment where I completely flip the script and mercilessly take back exactly what is mine. The morning of that Thanksgiving Thursday was crisp, cold, and beautifully clear. A stark and poetic contrast to the freezing, miserable blizzard I had endured 8 years prior when my parents threw me out onto the street. While Robert, Susan, and Chloe were busy frantically basting turkeys and polishing their stolen silver, desperately preparing to host 60 of the city's most elite, judgmental high society members, I was sitting in a quiet, heavily paneled conference room at the county courthouse with my lead real estate attorney. You see, the bank hadn't just threatened foreclosure. They had actively moved forward with it in absolute secrecy, scheduling a rapid public auction for the estate that very morning to recoup their massive losses. Because my parents had completely buried their heads in the sand, assuming their manipulative extortion plan with me was a guaranteed success, they didn't even bother to track the legal proceedings of their own impending doom. Sitting in that auction room, I didn't feel a single ounce of hesitation as I raised my paddle. I bought my grandfather's beloved estate, the exact same property my family had violently stolen from me, straight back from the bank, paying for it entirely in cold, hard cash. As my lawyer handed me the freshly stamped, undisputed deed proving I was now the sole, legal owner of the property, a profound, electric sense of vindication washed over my entire soul. The trap was fully set, the lock was secured, and all I had to do now was walk directly into the lion's den and watch them burn. Later that evening, I pulled my sleek, unassuming car up to the massive iron gates of the estate. The driveway was absolutely packed with leased Mercedes-Benzes, Range Rovers, and Porsches belonging to my parents' wealthy, oblivious country club friends. Walking through the heavy oak front doors of my grandfather's house for the first time in 8 years was a surreal, out-of-body experience. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered food, expensive perfume, and the loud, arrogant chatter of people who measure their self-worth by their stock portfolios. Robert and Susan were holding court in the center of the grand living room, holding crystal champagne flutes and acting like absolute royalty. When they saw me walk in, their eyes lit up with a sickening, predatory greed. They immediately rushed over, pulling me into aggressively fake hugs, loudly announcing to all the nearby guests that their prodigal, brilliant daughter had finally returned home for the holidays. Chloe was standing near the fireplace with her pretentious fiancé, wearing a diamond necklace that was definitely bought on a maxed-out credit card, glaring at me with unfiltered jealousy, but forcing a painfully stiff smile because she knew her entire fake-rich future depended on the massive check they thought I was about to write. I played along perfectly. I smiled, shook hands with the snobby neighbors who used to look down on me, and quietly took my seat at the massive, beautifully decorated dining table, waiting patiently for the main event. Have you ever had to sit through a family dinner knowing a massive, relationship-ending explosion was literally just minutes away? Tell me how you handled that suffocating tension in the comments, because my heart was beating so loudly, I was genuinely terrified the person sitting next to me could hear it. Right as the extravagant dessert was being served, the moment finally arrived. Robert stood up at the head of the table, tapping his silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute until the room of 60 elite guests fell completely silent. He puffed out his chest, put on his most charming, authoritative voice, and launched into a grand, sickeningly manipulative speech about the true meaning of family unity and overcoming past misunderstandings. He dramatically wiped a completely fake tear from his eye as he looked directly at me, loudly announcing to the entire room that his incredibly successful daughter, Maya, was presenting the family with a generous, life-changing financial gift to help consolidate some business investments and preserve the family legacy. The sheer social pressure was astronomical. Every single eye in that room instantly locked onto me, clapping politely and beaming with approval. Robert smiled like a victorious predator, walked over to my chair, and handed me a microphone they had specifically set up for the toasts, along with a silver pen, fully expecting me to pull out my checkbook and publicly write them an $800,000 bailout right then and there. I slowly stood up, taking the cold microphone in my hand. I looked around the room at the sea of expectant, wealthy faces, then looked down at Robert, whose arrogant smirk was practically glowing. "Thank you, Robert, for that incredibly touching speech," I said, my voice echoing crystal clear through the massive dining room. "It truly is a season of giving and a season of profound transitions. However, there has been a slight misunderstanding." Robert's smirk faltered just a fraction of an inch, a tiny flicker of confusion crossing his eyes. "I am not writing a check for $800,000 tonight," I announced calmly. A confused murmur rippled through the 60 guests. "In fact, I'm not giving you a single dime to pay off the massive, crippling debt you secretly accrued by treating my grandfather's house like your personal ATM." The silence that violently crashed down over the room was so heavy it was practically suffocating. Susan gasped loudly, her face turning chalk white, while Chloe's fiancé looked around in sheer, panicked confusion. "Maya, what are you doing?" "Stop this right now," Robert hissed venomously under his breath, desperately trying to grab the microphone back, but I took a firm step away, completely out of his reach. "8 years ago," I continued, raising my voice so every single person in the back of the room could hear the undeniable truth. "These people, my own parents, used a disgusting legal loophole to violently evict me from this exact house in the dead of winter, leaving me homeless and living in my car, just so they could give my inheritance to their golden child. For years, they told you all that I ran away. They lied. They threw me out like garbage." The country club guests were now staring in absolute, paralyzed horror, the fake rich facade of the perfect family instantly shattering before their very eyes. I reached into my designer blazer and pulled out the thick, blue legal folder I had received from the courthouse that morning. "But karma is a beautiful, relentless thing," I stated, holding the folder up high. "Because Robert and Susan couldn't control their obsessive need to impress all of you, they took out multiple secret mortgages and completely bankrupted this estate. The bank quietly foreclosed on this house. And this morning, at 9:00 a.m., I bought it at the public auction. In cash. I unclipped the documents and dramatically slammed them down onto the center of the dining table, right next to the extravagant Thanksgiving turkey. I am the sole legal owner of this property. And Robert, Susan, Chloe, this is your official, legal 30-day notice of eviction. The absolute pandemonium that erupted in that dining room was like a bomb going off. Susan literally collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically as the crushing reality of her complete social and financial ruin finally hit her. Robert stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, utterly destroyed by the fact that his brilliant, manipulative extortion trap had just publicly humiliated him in front of the only people whose opinions he cared about. Chloe started screaming at her parents, demanding to know where all the money went, but her fiancé didn't even wait for an answer. Realizing he was marrying into a broke, toxic, fraudulent family, he practically threw his napkin on the table, turned on his heel, and walked straight out the front door without looking back. The wealthy neighbors and elite friends, absolutely disgusted by the revelation of my parents' cruelty and deeply embarrassed by the massive financial scandal unfolding in real time, immediately began grabbing their coats and whispering furiously as they practically sprinted for the exit. Within 20 minutes, the grand, boastful Thanksgiving dinner was completely empty, leaving nothing but my shattered, sobbing family sitting amidst the ruins of their fake empire. I didn't stay to listen to their desperate, pathetic apologies or their frantic begging. I simply turned my back on them, walked out the front doors of my house, and drove back to my luxury penthouse in the city, feeling lighter, happier, and more free than I had ever felt in my entire life. True to the legal notice, 30 days later, the sheriff arrived and physically escorted them off the premises. They were forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely ostracized from their high society circles, forced to finally live in the exact same poverty they had so mercilessly condemned me to. But my story doesn't end with revenge. It ends with purpose. I completely gutted my grandfather's house, removing every single trace of my parents' toxic pretentiousness, and fully renovated it into a beautiful, secure transitional housing facility for young adults who have been kicked out of their homes by abusive or unsupportive families. It is now a place of healing, a place where people who have hit rock bottom can find the support, resources, and love they need to rebuild their lives and discover their true potential. And exactly 1 year later, I hosted a new Thanksgiving dinner in that house, surrounded by the incredible, resilient residents, my fiercely loyal chosen family, and the people who truly matter. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire agonizing, beautiful journey is that blood does not automatically make someone family, and setting brutal, uncompromising boundaries to protect your peace is never, ever selfish. You do not owe your success, your sanity, or your hard-earned wealth to the people who tried to destroy you in your darkest moments. The absolute best revenge you can ever get on a toxic abuser is massive, undeniable success, and a life lived beautifully, happily, and entirely on your own terms. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all the incredible support. And if you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button, share your own experiences in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video. Welcome back, everyone. If you thought the Thanksgiving dinner massacre was the end of this twisted family saga, you clearly don't know my parents, Robert and Susan. I genuinely believed that after being publicly humiliated in front of 60 elite guests, stripped of their fake wealth, and physically removed from the estate by the local sheriff, they would finally retreat into the shadows and leave me alone. But as many of you have pointed out in the comments, textbook narcissists possess a level of delusion that defies all logic and reason. They simply do not know how to walk away, and they certainly don't know how to accept defeat. Over the last week, my inbox and comments section have been absolutely flooded with thousands of you asking, do they ever just give up? The answer is a resounding no. They spent every waking moment festering in pure, unadulterated rage, refusing to take a single ounce of accountability for their own choices. Instead of reflecting on their cruelty, they convinced themselves that I had maliciously cheated them out of their rightful wealth. So, driven by a blinding, toxic entitlement, Robert managed to track down a shady, desperate personal injury lawyer who was willing to take a ridiculous case on contingency, promising them a massive, unearned payday. Out of nowhere, while I was sitting in my corporate office closing a multi-million-dollar commercial deal, I was served with a massive civil lawsuit. My own parents were officially suing me for predatory real estate practices and severe emotional distress, wildly claiming that I had colluded with bank executives to rig the foreclosure auction and steal the family estate. Can you even fathom the unhinged audacity it takes to sue the child you previously made homeless? Have you ever had a toxic relative try to use the legal system to bully, drain, or intimidate you into compliance? Tell me about your absolute worst legal nightmare stories in the comments below, because seeing that subpoena cross my mahogany desk almost made me laugh out loud. When the day of the preliminary hearing arrived, I walked into the downtown civil courthouse flanked by my firm's elite, high-powered corporate legal team. I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit, feeling completely calm and ready to put the final, undeniable nail in their metaphorical coffin. Robert, Susan, and Chloe were sitting at the plaintiff's table when I walked in. Robert had dug his very last decent suit out of his cramped closet, attempting to project that same arrogant authority he used to wield at the country club, acting as if he owned the courtroom. Susan was clutching a tissue, fully prepared to turn on the fake waterworks, while Chloe just looked utterly exhausted, staring blankly at the floor, wearing a cheap uniform from her retail job. When the judge, a strict, no-nonsense man with zero patience for frivolous lawsuits, called the court to order, my parents' lawyer launched into his opening statement. It was a spectacular piece of utter fiction. He painted my parents as innocent, loving victims who had been ruthlessly preyed upon by their cold, calculating corporate shark daughter. He tried to argue that I had used insider secrets to orchestrate the foreclosure. I just sat there, my face a completely unreadable stone mask, writing a single note on my yellow legal pad and sliding it over to my lead attorney. The note just said, "End them." When it was our turn, my lawyer didn't rely on emotional theatrics. He relied on ironclad, meticulously documented facts. He stood up and presented the judge with a massive binder filled with bank records, property deeds, and email transcripts. He systematically dismantled every single one of their ridiculous claims within 5 minutes. But my legal team didn't just come to defend my name. They came to completely destroy my parents' ability to ever file another frivolous lawsuit. In a brilliant, devastating countermove, my lawyers had subpoenaed my parents' original loan applications from the bank. My lawyer informed the judge that during discovery, we had uncovered something highly irregular and incredibly illegal. It turns out that to qualify for those massive loans to fund their superficial lifestyle, Robert and Susan hadn't just exaggerated their wealth. They had committed blatant, undeniable felony mortgage fraud. They had knowingly forged income statements, falsified federal tax returns, and drastically inflated their non-existent business assets to trick the bank into handing over the cash. The entire courtroom went dead silent. You could literally hear the frantic, hyperventilating breaths of my mother as the horrifying reality of what was actually happening washed over her. Robert's arrogant chest instantly deflated, his face turning a sickening shade of gray as he looked at the undeniable evidence of his own federal crimes projected onto the courtroom monitor. The judge slowly lowered his glasses, his face turning dark with absolute, unfiltered fury. He didn't just throw their lawsuit out of court. He looked directly at my parents with pure disgust and slapped them with tens of thousands of dollars in legal sanctions for wasting the court's time and filing a malicious claim. But the absolute cherry on top, the glorious, poetic climax of the entire hearing that I will cherish forever, was when the judge explicitly stated on the public record that he was officially forwarding all the evidence of their mortgage fraud and forged tax documents directly to the district attorney, and the IRS for an immediate, comprehensive criminal investigation. Chloe, who had been sitting silently the entire time, finally snapped. She stood up in the middle of the courtroom, turned to her terrified, speechless parents, and began screaming hysterically, realizing that their toxic obsession with a fake-rich image had not only ruined her life, but was now going to make her the daughter of convicted felons. She stormed out of the courtroom in tears, leaving Robert and Susan sitting there completely alone, shattered, and facing the absolute, irreversible destruction of their future. I calmly stood up, buttoned my designer blazer, thanked the judge, and walked out of the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse, stepping into the bright, warm city sunlight. The heavy, suffocating shadow of my toxic family was finally, permanently lifted. They were no longer my problem, they were the government's problem. I got into my waiting car, drove back to my corporate office, poured myself a hot cup of coffee, and got back to building my empire, feeling an incredible, profound sense of peace. If you take anything away from this insane legal drama, let it be this. Never underestimate the destructive power of a narcissist's ego, but more importantly, never underestimate your own ability to outsmart them with the truth, flawless preparation, and uncompromising boundaries. Let them dig their own graves while you focus on building your beautiful life. Thank you so much for watching this crazy update. Please hit that like and subscribe button to support the channel. Drop your thoughts on this glorious karma in the comments below, and always remember to protect your peace. If you thought the legal destruction of my parents' fraudulent mortgage scheme was the final act, you are underestimating the sheer, unrelenting nature of toxic obsession. While the federal investigation into their mortgage fraud was turning their carefully curated lives into a public spectacle, I found myself navigating a strange, quiet aftermath. You see, when you spend 8 years fueled by the singular, burning need to survive and prove your worth, reaching the top of the mountain feels less like a party and more like a heavy, silent vigil. I spent my days not in celebration, but in a strange state of reflection, watching from a distance as my parents' reputation dissolved in the court of public opinion. The same high society circles that once toasted them were now actively distancing themselves, treating them like a contagious disease. It's a bitter truth, isn't it? That for people like Robert and Susan, the only thing more painful than losing their wealth was losing the validation they desperately craved from people who never truly cared about them in the first place. I have to ask you all, have you ever had to watch someone who hurt you finally face the consequences of their own actions, only to realize that the victory felt more like a hollow, sobering lesson in human nature than a glorious triumph? Drop a comment below, because I know I'm not the only one who realized that watching a narcissist fall is a complicated, painful process. As the legal proceedings dragged on, I started receiving anonymous messages, then phone calls from former employees of my father's firm, from friends of the family who felt they'd been misled, and even from acquaintances who had been burned by Chloe's entitled behavior. They weren't calling to ask for money. They were calling to offer apologies for not seeing what was happening, for staying silent, for letting the mayor's name intimidate them into looking the other way. I didn't need their apologies to validate my existence, but hearing them did something unexpected. It helped me decouple my identity from the pain they had inflicted. I realized that my success wasn't just a byproduct of my anger. It was an affirmation of my resilience. I decided to pivot. I began leveraging my firm's resources not just for commercial development, but to establish a foundation dedicated to helping young people who had been disowned, evicted, or abandoned by families prioritizing image over humanity. We provided housing, legal support, and the exact kind of mentorship that Alina Vance had once given me, a chance to build something real from the ruins. Every time I signed a contract for a new transitional housing unit, I felt the weight of that freezing night in the Honda Civic finally, permanently lift. But the story didn't end with me simply moving on. It ended with a final, unavoidable confrontation. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter in the mail, not a subpoena, not a lawyer's threat, but a handwritten note from my mother. It was thin, trembling, and devoid of the usual performative drama. She didn't ask for a reconciliation, and she didn't try to justify the past. She simply detailed the mundane, crushing reality of their new life. A life in a small, noisy apartment near the interstate, the loss of every luxury they had once held as central to their existence, and the quiet, agonizing realization that they had completely alienated their own daughter. She wrote about watching Chloe, who had finally hit a breaking point and moved across the country to try and escape the shame, and the profound, irreparable silence that now filled their home. For the first time, she didn't mention money. She didn't mention the house. She mentioned her regret. I held that letter for a long time, staring at the familiar handwriting that used to trigger immediate panic in my chest. And for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. No anger, no longing, no desire for revenge. Just a profound, liberating indifference. I realized that the greatest power they ever had over me was my belief that they could still hurt me, or that they could ever provide the love I had been so desperately starving for as a child. By acknowledging that love was never on the table, I had finally become truly, unshakably free. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. The silence wasn't a punishment. It was simply the end of the conversation. I went back to my work, back to my mentor, back to the life I had carved out with my own hands. People often ask me if I regret the way I handled the Thanksgiving dinner or if I wish I had been kinder. Let me ask you, how much kindness do you owe to people who would rather see you freeze to death than see their image tarnished? How much of your life are you willing to sacrifice on the altar of forgiving people who haven't even learned how to be sorry? I don't regret a single second of the fight, because that fight wasn't just about a house or a bank account. It was about the right to exist without someone else trying to decide who I was, what I deserved, or how I should be treated. I had reclaimed my name, my history, and my future. And as I sat in my office that evening, watching the sunset cast long, golden shadows across the development projects I had brought to life, I knew that the empire I had built was more than just steel and concrete. It was a monument to the girl who had nowhere to go and decided to build her own world instead. I want you to think about what you are currently building in your own life. Are you still waiting for the people who broke you to acknowledge the damage they did, or have you started the process of paving your own way? Because the truth is, the foundation of your future has to be built by you, and only you. The outside noise, the family gossip, the high society expectations. It's all just background static once you decide that your peace is the most valuable asset you own. If you've stuck with me through this entire saga, if you felt the frustration, the rage, and finally, the relief of seeing the truth come to light, then you are a part of the reason I'm still standing here. You've listened, you've engaged, and you've understood that being seen is the most powerful thing we can offer each other. If this journey has helped you see your own struggle in a new light, if it's given you the smallest push towards setting the boundary you've been terrified to set, then share your truth in the comments. We need to hear your wins, your struggles, and your reclamation stories. And if you're ready for the next level of building, of thriving, and of holding firm in your truth, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep this conversation going, because the world needs more people who refuse to stay invisible. Thank you for walking this path with me. Protect your peace, build your own foundation, and I'll see you in the next one. After the dust finally settled in that courtroom and the devastating truth of my parents' fraud was laid bare for the world to see, I realized that I hadn't just won a lawsuit. I had reclaimed the right to write my own ending. The wreckage of their high society reputation didn't concern me anymore, not because I was indifferent to their ruin, but because I had finally found the peace I had spent 30 years starving for. I didn't need their apology to feel whole, and I didn't need their approval to know my worth. My focus shifted entirely to the life I had curated, the transitional housing facility in my grandfather's house, the thriving landscape architecture firm, and the chosen family that had stood by me when my own blood chose greed over connection. I want to know if you've ever had to draw a hard line in the sand to save your own life, even when it meant walking away from everyone you were told to trust. If you are currently standing on your own porch in the rain with nothing but a suitcase and a fragile dream, please share your story in the comments below. Your journey matters, and reading your experiences might just give someone else the strength to finally set their own boundaries. And if you found comfort or courage in this saga, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. I have so many more stories of reclamation and resilience coming your way, and I want you to be part of this community. Thank you for walking this path with me, for protecting your peace, and for understanding that the truth is the only foundation worth building on. I'll see you in the next one.